Professor Rod Evans, and what I'm doing today is I'll be covering the second chapter of Business Ethics, the eighth edition by William H. Shaw, and this is for business ethics class for ODU Philosophy 303. The second chapter is dealing with ethical theories, and very broadly speaking, our author divides ethical theories into those that are principally consequentialist or non-consequentialist. Consequentialist ethical theories hold that our moral duties are determined by outcomes or results. An excellent example of a consequentialist ethical theory is utilitarianism. All forms of utilitarianism say that what we ought to do is based on outcomes or consequences. Outcomes of individual actions or outcomes of following networks of rules, okay, or if you like, moral codes. But according to utilitarianism, no action is intrinsically or inherently right or wrong. It's right or wrong in virtue of consequences. So utilitarianism is a good example of a consequentialist ethical theory. To the extent that a theory is non-consequentialist, it'll hold that moral duties involve more than evaluating consequences, but are to some extent determined by factors other than consequences. To the extent that a theory is non-consequentialist, it'll hold that an action can be inherently or intrinsically right or wrong. Now, there are at least some ethical theories that are intended to be purely non-consequentialist. There's another term for that, by the way, and that is deontological. Okay? Kant's ethical theory, by the way, is an excellent example of a theory that is intended to be purely deontological or non-consequentialist, which is to say that according to Immanuel Kant, who lived between like 1724 to 1804, Kant held that an action is intrinsically or inherently right or wrong, but it's not right or wrong because of consequences. And Kant believed that his ethical theory pretty much mirrored the ethical thinking of thoughtful people. But anyway, we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Purely consequentialist theories assert that the moral rightness of an action will depend on consequences. And the question becomes, well, how about consequences for whom? Well, everyone affected by the action. And according to some utilitarian thinkers, that could even include non-human animals. In other words, all sentient beings. But just for our purposes, we'll talk about the consequences for all people affected by the action, rather than just the agent, him or herself. That the utilitarian wants to maximize good consequences for everyone affected by the action. Although consequentialist theories want to produce actions that will produce or will probably produce at least as great a ratio of good to evil as any other course of action open to the agent, such theories will differ over whose welfare should be optimized. Should one try to maximize the welfare, again, of everyone affected by the action or only the agent? Well, I've just said that utilitarianism says everyone affected by the action. The book distinguishes utilitarianism, which holds that we should maximize the general welfare, from ethical or rational egoism, which holds that individuals should maximize their own self-interest. By contrast, non-consequentialist or deontological theories assert that right and wrong are determined by more than the likely consequences of an action. As Shaw, our author, says, non-consequentialists don't necessarily deny that consequences have some moral significance, but they believe that other factors are morally relevant to morally assessing actions. Non-consequentialists assert that promise breaking is wrong not simply because it can hurt feelings, damage reputations and inconvenience people. It's wrong because of its inherent character. For a non-consequentialist, it is possible for an action to be morally wrong even if it produces more happiness than unhappiness. Now, the book divides consequentialist theories basically into two: utilitarianism and then rational/ethical egoism. Now, things actually are more complicated than what the book suggests, but let me try to clarify this. We've just said that utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory. We've just said that it talks about right actions as determined by the consequences of the particular actions, or it talks about the consequences of following networks of rules or moral codes. Now, rational/ethical egoism talks about maximizing good consequences for the agent. Okay. Now, this gets tricky because there are some ethical or rational egoists who maintain that we need to some degree to have a theory that recognizes individual moral rights. Probably the most famous ethical or rational egoist was Ayn Rand. And Ayn Rand maintained that there are individual moral rights, and they are rights to life, liberty, and property, and that we need to respect these individual rights. Okay, and in other words, she was an ethical egoist, but she didn't believe that one could justify anything just by saying that it improved some agent's welfare. Okay, but I don't want to go too deeply into that right now. Let me just say this: that our author Shaw interprets ethical or rational egoism as a purely consequentialist theory, saying that we should each agent should maximize the good consequences for him or herself, or at least let's say that's the universal or impersonal variety of the theory, which is what Ayn Rand held, right? The difference, though, is Ayn Rand believed that moral agents, I mean all people, should be restrained by the idea of respecting people's individual rights. Okay, back to the book. The book interprets rational or ethical egoism as a purely consequentialist theory, saying that people should maximize their own self-interest. Now, the book talks principally, when it comes to non-consequentialist theories or deontological theories, it talks about Kant's theory. Again, Kant lived between 1724 and 1804. He's a good example of a person who's an Enlightenment figure, for whom reason is a kind of a centralizing and organizing concept. W.D. Ross was a 20th century British philosopher. He also was a non-consequentialist or a deontologist. His theory is based on what you might call ethical intuitionism, the idea that we can immediately intuit by our somebody would say our consciences, but in any event, he would say by our ethical intuition what is right or wrong. Although there's sometimes we're not sure. He says we can have conflicting ideas about what we should do, but he thought in general we can immediately apprehend the important moral properties of a situation. But in any event, so when it comes to deontological or non-consequentialist thinkers, the book principally talks about Immanuel Kant and W.D. Ross. Now, let me get back to ethical or rational egoism. The book talks about many misconceptions of ethical or rational egoism. First, it says that some people think an ethical egoist will be a person who's just concerned about maximizing self-interest in the short term. They go, well, that's not true. An ethical egoist needs to be concerned with long-term self-interest. And contrary to popular belief, ethical egoists, at least on some versions of the theory, may be required to undergo unpleasant or even painful experiences to maximize their long-term interests. They may have to exercise a lot of self-discipline and defer immediate gratification. The book goes on. Contrary to popular misconceptions, ethical egoists may be required to help other people to the extent that helping them will serve the agent's interests. Contrary to popular misconceptions, not all egoists will endorse hedonism or the view that pleasure is the only thing good in itself. In fact, some ethical egoists may endorse what modern psychologists call self-actualization. Note again that Ayn Rand, the most famous ethical egoist of the 20th century, believed in individual rights, including property rights. Ayn Rand believed that a rationally self-interested person will do his or her best to cultivate individual talents, take responsibility for actions, create tradable values, and not believe that he or she is entitled to the unearned. Many critics of ethical egoism don't think that the moral restrictions on individual freedom Rand recognized necessarily follow simply from the concept of rational self-interest. Well, let me now distinguish ethical egoism from psychological egoism, and you really need to know the difference. You're going to be tested on these terms. Although ethical egoism is a normative or a prescriptive theory, that is to say, a theory that recommends behavior or sets up a standard, psychological egoism is a descriptive theory purporting to describe how people in fact behave. Psychological egoism, at least a popular version of it, says that all people do what they believe will promote their self-interest. Let me put this up there. Psychological egoism says, at least in a popular version of it, all people always do what they believe will promote their self-interest. It's a descriptive theory purporting to talk about what is rather than what should be. Okay. Now, what are some criticisms of psychological egoism? Well, according to the critics, the theory contradicts experience. Passers-by, for example, will sometimes risk injury or death to help strangers trapped in burning cars. It appears that people sometimes choose to do what they believe is right, even at great personal cost. So some people think that the theory, our author believes this, that the theory is an overgeneralization. That if the theory said, well, people usually or often very largely pursue their own self-interest, it wouldn't be controversial and it may even be correct. But the theory in its most usual form says that all people always do what they believe is in their self-interest, which embodies a universal generalization, and the critics say that it's a false universal generalization. Now, I do want to talk a little, well, universal / impersonal ethical or rational egoism says, again, that all people should always promote their enlightened self-interest. And that typically relates to, or in fact may even be identified with, long-term happiness. Personal ethical egoism should be distinguished from impersonal or universal ethical egoism. Remember what I said? I said Ayn Rand is a good example of a universal or impersonal ethical egoist because she believed that all people should promote their enlightened self-interest. But she had a very specific notion of what, or idea of what enlightened self-interest consists in, and it has to do with developing a certain kind of character and having a good conscience and developing one's talents, taking responsibility for one's actions. And I don't want to go all into that, but those are some of its features. I do want to talk, though, more about personal ethical egoism. Let's suppose that Popeye, the sailor man, is a personal ethical egoist. Well, that means that Popeye believes that he, Popeye, should promote his enlightened self-interest, but he doesn't believe that other people should promote their self-interest. He doesn't believe that Olive Oyl or Brutus should promote their self-interest. He just believes that he should promote his self-interest. He'd probably prefer that other people promote his self-interest. Now, that theory often has been criticized as leading people possibly to mistreating other people simply for their own benefit. And some people dispute whether it even should be called an ethical theory rather than just a personal action guide. I mean, typically ethical theories say that all people should pursue certain ways of living, whereas personal ethical egoism just talks about the people who accept the theory. But in any event, the people who criticize it say that it's morally unacceptable. They say that the theory, as a matter of fact, could, again, lead people to mistreat others simply for their own benefit. Now, the other thing that I just want to talk a little bit more about Ayn Rand. Again, Ayn Rand is an example of an impersonal or universal ethical egoist. And she believed that it's possible, as I've suggested before, to believe in individual moral rights and still be an egoist. She thought that to maximize human flourishing, we need to respect individuals and regard them as possessing rights. Her belief was that a commitment to individual rights would enable us to create moral and legal systems under which people would flourish, and systems that would allow for both competition and cooperation, as in sports or as in an efficient market economy. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about utilitarianism. I had mentioned earlier that utilitarianism is really an excellent example of a purely consequentialist ethical theory. Remember what I said before? I said utilitarianism says an action is right either because of its consequences or because it follows from a networks of rules, general conformity to which will maximize happiness. Okay, so for utilitarianism, it's going to say that we should act to produce the greatest balance of good over evil for all those affected by our actions. What is often called classical utilitarianism says that only pleasure is intrinsically or inherently good, and that we should maximize the net pleasure, that is to say, the amount of pleasure we create minus the amount of pain caused by some action. Because you can well imagine, if you're doing something that affects the welfare of lots of people, you could elevate the pleasure of some people and you could actually reduce the pleasure of someone else. Now, John Stuart Mill, was an excellent example of a utilitarian. He was a British philosopher, very famous, and he and another philosopher who was actually born in the generation right before Mill, Jeremy Bentham, where both of those were good examples of classical utilitarians. And again, they believed that pleasure is the only thing intrinsically good, and we should maximize the net pleasure. But Mill, unlike Bentham, believed that pleasures can differ not only in quantity but also in quality. Bentham held that it is self-contradictory to assert that pleasure alone is intrinsically or inherently good, and yet that some pleasures are better than others in quality. I think one way to think of it is, suppose someone says all that matters is how much money someone earns, okay? But then someone says, but money earned in the private sector is better than money earned in the public sector, okay? Well, someone might say, well, if all that matters is how much money one earns, why are you making a further distinction? Well, that's how Bentham thought about the belief that pleasures could differ in quality. Bentham thought that if someone believes that pleasure is the only thing intrinsically good, the person has no business recommending one pleasure over another unless one has quantitative reasons. In other words, unless one pleasure is lasting longer, unless it's unless it's greater and affecting more people. So what I want to say is that Bentham, unlike Mill, believed that pleasures can differ only in quantity. Mill believed that pleasures can differ in quantity and quality. Mill believed that if you ask someone equally familiar with the vast array of pleasures, that the person in general would prefer what Mill called the higher pleasures to the lower. He thought that intellectual pleasures, the pursuit of wisdom and the pursuit of knowledge, he thought that those pleasures were put it this way, were superior in quality to purely physical pleasures. You don't need to know the ins and outs of all that, but you need to know that both Mill and Bentham were classical utilitarians, and Mill believed that pleasures can differ in quantity and quality, whereas Bentham believed that pleasures can differ only in quantity. Now, the other thing that I want to point out is the book talks about 6 points about utilitarianism. And again, I've talked a little bit about this already, but let me just go over this briefly. First, when deciding which action will promote the greatest happiness, we must count the pain and unhappiness as well. So that's why we talk about the net pleasure. Our goal is to produce the action with the greatest net pleasure or happiness, the amount of pleasure or happiness after discounting the action for any pain it causes. And second, utilitarianism says that we need to roughly assess the effects on everyone affected. Some people will be made happier, some will perhaps be a little happier, and some may be made less happy. Third, because utilitarianism bases rightness on consequences. Theoretically, no action is going to be intrinsically or inherently right or wrong according to it, and any action could theoretically be right, including possibly torturing innocent people. Fourth, utilitarian calculations include long-term predictions. Fifth, utilitarian calculations are based on the likely consequences because we don't have perfect knowledge of the future. And sixth and finally, we are supposed to include the projected effects of the proposed action on the agent's happiness, but those effects can be discounted by the effects on others. Why? Because the world consists of mostly other people. In other words, utilitarianism could call for self-sacrifice. Defenders of utilitarianism will normally say that it provides a basis for arbitrating among conflicting interests, and we should act so that we can create the greatest good for the greatest number. Defenders further say that it provides a flexible, result-oriented approach to moral decision-making and doesn't ask us to deal with intuitions and lots of abstractions. But what are some critical inquiries of utilitarianism? Well, the book points out some of these. Is utilitarianism really workable? How can we have enough knowledge of the future to make long-term predictions of consequences for people who are, after all, individuals and who can be affected differently by the same action? Let me say further. The same person can value the same thing differently over time. There are times when I don't want my favorite meal, especially after I've just had it, right? Or if I desperately need sleep. Because in other words, I don't value the same thing to the same degree and in the same way all the time. Also, are some actions wrong even if they produce good? Suppose a woman on her deathbed gets you to promise to give her $25,000 to her nephew, who's a drunkard and a spendthrift, who will waste the money on riotous parties in a week. Would it be wrong to break that promise and to appropriate, or someone might say misappropriate, the woman's money by giving the money to an orphanage, even if giving the money to orphanage would maximize happiness? And another question is utilitarianism unjust, or might it be unjust? Because utilitarianism is concerned with maximizing the general happiness and isn't inherently concerned with how the happiness is distributed, could it lead to the exploitation of individuals or minorities? I mean, could you have a situation in which 99% of the people end up enslaving the other 1%? Now, I want to talk a bit about the interplay between self-interest and utility. There are people who will argue that the pursuit of rational self-interest, at least under the rule of law that punishes fraud and violence, can actually promote the general welfare. Famously, the 18th century economist Adam Smith argued that people are generally self-interested, but that doesn't mean they will automatically be antisocial. He said that bakers aren't driven to promote the general good directly, but they'll directly pursue their own interests, and presumably those of their families. Henry Ford, for example, was out to make a lot of money for himself and his family, but he made the money by mass-producing cars in such a way that he was able to pay really good wages for the day to his workers and please huge numbers of consumers. We've talked so far about utilitarianism, and even though I might not have called it this, to some degree we're talking about what might be called act utilitarianism, which says that whenever we act, we need to choose the happiness maximizing act, or what some people might call the optimific act. The optimific act. Optimific. Oops. Okay, now, but there are other forms of utilitarianism. There are forms of utilitarianism that are called rule utilitarianism. Now, rule utilitarians say that our moral duties shouldn't be determined by assessing individual actions, but by assessing and creating moral codes as a whole, which will embody networks of rules. Now, one view of this is called optimal code utilitarianism, and it's associated, for example, with the philosopher Richard Brandt. Richard Brandt, optimal code utilitarianism. Richard Brandt. Now, according to optimal code utilitarianism, an act which occurs within a particular society will be right in that society if it is permitted by the optimal moral code of that society. Now, a society will have an optimal moral code to the extent that most people follow most of the time that collection of rules, maximizing happiness for the society. The rules need to be teachable, and they need to be capable of being followed by most people most of the time. Now, why does Richard Brandt and other optimal code utilitarians reject act utilitarianism? Well, Brandt says that asking people to maximize the happiness of each act won't maximize happiness any more than asking people to maximize good driving will maximize good driving. He says that we need specific rules just as we have traffic lights and signs and various regulations. Now, according to Brandt and other rule utilitarians, they hold that if we acted as act utilitarians are supposed to act, we'd constantly make mistakes trying to predict the consequences of each act. Further, we'd probably lie and break promises more often than we do now because we'd constantly be trying to predict the consequences of telling the truth versus the consequences of lying in specific contexts instead of almost automatically telling the truth. And still further, the act utilitarian principle is unrealistic according to the rule utilitarian critics and is too demanding because we aren't equipped to calculate before every action what action will promote total well-being. An action will be wrong according, again, to this moral code utilitarianism, not if it doesn't in itself maximize happiness, but only if it conflicts with the ideal moral code for that society. To quote William Shaw, our author, it would make sense, for example, to instill in people an aversion to telling white lies. In addition, the ideal code would acknowledge moral rights. Teaching people to respect moral rights will maximize human welfare in the long run. What are some criticisms? What are some criticisms of rule utilitarianism? Well, act utilitarians will accuse rule utilitarians of rule worship and valuing rules over always doing what maximizes happiness. Non-consequentialists will argue that by making consequences the ultimate standard of morality, rule utilitarianism ultimately subordinates rights to utilitarian calculation and doesn't ultimately properly value rights or the inherent value of persons. Now, I want to slightly shift gears and talk about the deontological ethical theories, the non-consequentialist ethical theories talked about by our author, Shaw. And most notably, I want to begin by talking about Immanuel Kant. Now, what I said before is Immanuel Kant was a German philosopher, a child of the Enlightenment, so for him, reason is going to be of paramount importance. And Immanuel Kant is an excellent example of a deontological ethical theory. In fact, his theory is intended to be purely non-consequentialist. Now, let me say something about Kant. Like many ethical thinkers, and Kant wrote a lot of philosophy other than just ethics, but he's also very famous for his ethical writing. But when it comes to ethical writing, Kant believed that his ethical theory clarifies the underlying logic of the way in which reasonable ethical thinkers think. He did not think he was in any way creating a new ethical theory, but rather he believed he was clarifying the underlying logic of good ethical thinking. Okay, I want to emphasize that. Okay, now here's another thing I want to emphasize. I want to talk about moral motivation in Kant, and then after I talk about moral motivation, I'm going to talk about Kant's supreme ethical standard. Okay, I'll talk about that. Now, let's talk about moral motivation. At the center of Kant's ethical theory is a notion, an idea of moral motivation. Kant says we have a good will when we're morally motivated. And we're morally motivated when we do what is right because it's right. In other words, we act in accordance with duty for the sake of duty. According to Kant, nothing is good in itself or unconditionally good except a good will. Again, will in this context describes our ability to act from principles, and we have a good will when we do what is right because it's right. Let me give you an example that Kant gave. It's an example of a merchant. Imagine a merchant who deals honestly with his customers. Okay? Well, Kant says someone could deal honestly with his or her customers for various reasons, from various motives. A merchant may deal honestly with customers from self-interest, from benevolence or a kind heart, or from a sense of duty. For Kant, if we deal honestly with our customers to help our business and not to do what is right, we're not morally motivated. Yes, we've done something that's good in some sense. I mean, it's socially beneficial. It's good that we've done that. But Kant says if you're going to really look at our action and the full moral context, what we did was not worthy of moral esteem. If you act in accordance with duty for the sake of duty, you're morally motivated, and what you're doing is worthy of moral esteem. But if you acted simply out of self-interest, and you would not have done the action if it did not redound to your self-interest, Kant says you are not morally motivated. Okay, well, let's suppose another example or another case that's connected to this example of the merchant. If you suppose you deal honestly with your customers, but that's only because you're kind and good-hearted. In other words, you did what is right, but your action was not done for the sake of duty. Well, Kant said that, well, in that case, again, it's good that you're that way. It's good that you happen to be a kind, good-hearted person. Nonetheless, what you did is not worthy of moral esteem. But if you did what is right because it's right, you have exemplified a goodwill, and you're morally motivated, and your action is worthy of moral esteem. Now, Kant was a very sophisticated thinker, and so he understood that we can't see into people's hearts. He understood that perhaps some people could have multiple motives. Perhaps somebody did something because it's right, but the person also is a kind-hearted person. So things get tricky in discerning whether someone had a good will. Kant would say, well, it's easier to determine what's right than whether some other person had a good will, because we can't see into someone's heart. But what he's trying to do is to clarify what he believes having a good will would consist in. In short, again, you're morally motivated when you do what is right because it is right. You do what is right because it's right. But how, according to Kant, should we determine what is right? Should we determine what's right? Well, the answer is according to the categorical imperative. Okay, the categorical imperative, right? So then the question might be, well, what is the categorical imperative? Well, first of all, what does the word categorical mean? Categorical imperative. Well, let's break it down. Categorical, imperative. Categorical imperative, the word categorical means unconditional or unqualified. And the word categorical. Now, the word imperative is something that must be done. Okay, so according to Kant, our moral requirements, if they're genuine moral requirements, will bind us unconditionally. And so you can regard them as examples of categorical imperatives. And you could also regard the ultimate moral standard for determining what is right or what is wrong as the categorical imperative. Okay, so what is an example? Let me give you a formula for the categorical imperative. Well, by the way, Kant said that when you act intentionally, you're acting implicitly according to some personal rule, which he called your maxim, M-A-X-I-M. So an act is going to be morally right, okay, if the rule behind it, or the maxim of the agent, can be willed to function as a universal law by all rational beings thinking rationally. This is the feature of universalizability that Kant said that any morally right action will have. Again, an act is morally right if the rule behind it or its maxim can be willed to function universal law by all rational beings thinking rationally. Okay, so the ultimate moral standard must be completely rational and bind all rational beings. Okay, now, so let me give you an example. Suppose some individual agent is making a promise, but makes the promise with a view to breaking it at his or her earliest convenience. So Kant would say, can all rational beings thinking rationally assent to a rule that says let people make promises with a view to breaking them at their earliest convenience? And Kant says no. He says the whole idea is logically incoherent. The whole point of promise making is to bind people to an uncertain future, especially when discharging the promise is inconvenient. So if everyone is morally entitled to break promises whenever he or she feels like it, then according to Kant, that you have a kind of a logically incoherent situation. In other words, you have someone wanting to promises to be believed, someone who wants people to act in accordance with promise making and keeping, and yet the person at the same time is undermining the conditions necessary, in fact, in some level rejecting conditions necessary for the keeping of promises. Well, let's look at, okay, so we've talked about, there are other features, by the way, of the categorical imperative. For example, you could say that an act will be right only if rational beings will be willing to universalize the rule or maxim for the action, but they also need to be willing to receive the action. Okay? Now think about this for a minute. Okay? Suppose somebody is a Nazi, and the person believes, well, it is right just to kill all Jewish people and gypsies and gays. Okay? Then that person, according to Kant, in order for that person to be following a moral rule, would have to believe that it would be morally right for that person to be killed if that person were gay, or if that person were Jewish, or if that person's best friend were gay or Jewish. The person would have to say, yes, it would be morally right to kill that person. So, and again, that person would have to say also, if that person were acting morally conscientiously, that person would have to say, yes, it would be right to kill me if I were had any of the features of the minorities that the Nazis killed. Now, another feature of the categorical imperative, according to Kant, is that one must always act so as to treat people, including oneself, as ends in themselves and never merely as means to ends. According to Kant, respecting others implies always treating them as ends in themselves, and again, never as some means to ends, valuing them as intrinsically valuable as rational beings. People should be regarded as having dignity, as having intrinsic value, and not simply looked at according to their being useful to others. Okay? Because we as rational beings recognize ourselves as having inherent intrinsic worth, we shouldn't wish to be treated merely as objects by others. Similarly, our respecting others' rationality requires treating them as intrinsically or inherently valuable. Now, what does this mean? Well, for example, if you're defrauding someone, you're treating that person merely as a means to an end. The word merely and its equivalent in other languages will be very important. If you use, let's suppose that you call a cab, and let's suppose you can pay in cash. I know a lot of people don't do that any longer, but suppose you're supposed to pay in cash after you get delivered to wherever you want. But let's suppose you don't intend to do this. The cab driver takes you to your destination. You run out and you stiff the cab driver. You don't pay. Well, then that's treating that person merely as a means to an end. Now, if you paid the person, you're actually engaging in a productive economic transaction for mutual benefit. That doesn't involve exploitation. But Kant would say if you're treating someone merely as a means to an end, then you are mistreating the person. Kant thought that rational beings, again, will always regard themselves and others as inherently valuable because of the possession of reason. People who want to break promises whenever they feel like it cannot will that everyone, as I said earlier, should be permitted to act similarly, because they would be, in a sense, as I said earlier, calling for a contradiction. Let people make promises that will be believed and respected, and then let people be free to break promises, creating disrespect of and distrust in promise making. Now, let me talk about Kant within an organizational context. The categorical imperative rejects certain practices as intrinsically wrong, including lying and fraud. The categorical imperative forbids treating individuals unfairly or unjustly to maximize general happiness. The categorical imperative alerts us to the importance of moral motivation. But here are some critical questions or inquiries people can ask of Kant's ethics. Why doesn't an action have moral worth when it arises out of compassion or sympathy, as when people are moved to give to a famine relief fund by pictures of starving children? Why should we accept Kant's belief that it is never right to lie or break promises? The rule, don't lie unless you must, to prevent serious harm to innocent people, seems to be universalizable. First of all, it isn't always clear also when you're treating someone merely as a means to an end. Kant believed that sexual prostitution, for example, even among consenting adults, involves treating people merely as means to ends. But isn't voluntary sex sharply different from coercive sex? Now, furthermore, we can universalize qualified rules, again, such as don't break promises except when doing so is needed to prevent grave harm to innocent people. But note that determining how moral rules should be qualified may involve an appeal to consequences, an appeal that Kant would presumably reject. Now, I do want to talk about other non-consequentialist theories, and most notably that of the British philosopher W.D. Ross, who lived from 1877 to 1970. He thought Ross thought that both utilitarianism and Kantian ethical theories were flawed, and they oversimplified the moral life. Ross thought that Kantian theory, let's put it this way, he thought that Kant was wrong to think that it is always wrong to break promises and always wrong to lie, for example. Ross thought that moral rules have variable weight, and I'm going to get into that in a moment. And Ross was very suspicious of any ethical theory that says there was one ultimate standard that could explain why anything is morally right or morally wrong. He thought the sources of our moral duties are diverse and complex, that sometimes we have moral duties because of our role responsibilities, that a physician has moral duties to his or her patients. Parents have moral duties to their children. Sometimes people have moral duties because of their agreements, their promises, or their contracts, and that they're generated. Those duties are generated by such agreements. Sometimes people have moral duties simply because of the bonds of humanity, as when someone is on a pier and then someone is drowning in front of the person. Now, Ross held that our moral duties have various sources, and you can't say all of them flow from the categorical imperative or some utilitarian principle of maximizing good consequences. Now, Ross held that while many of our moral duties are grounded in our roles and our relationships, some of our duties are general. For example, we should treat all people fairly. We should try to remedy injustices and try to promote human welfare generally. Let's put it this way. Ross believed that in some circumstances we have moral considerations that can conflict. For example, in general, we should keep promises, but there may be circumstances in which we're morally justified in breaking a promise. Let's say we should also normally help gravely injured people if we can easily help at little or no cost or danger to ourselves. Suppose I promised to meet someone for lunch but encountered an injured friend on the way to lunch who desperately needs to be rushed to the hospital. My duty to help the friend can override a promise to meet someone for lunch. Now, that doesn't mean I don't owe the person to whom I made the promise to meet for lunch an explanation, perhaps even an apology, but it does mean, according to Ross, that I can be justified in breaking that promise to rush someone to the hospital. So Ross talked about what he called prima facie duties. Now, by the way, Ross, like Kant, believed that his ethical theory mirrors the enlightened ethical thinking of people. Okay, so he didn't think he was imposing his values on people, but simply clarifying the underlying logic of moral thinking. So in any event, Ross has this idea I shouldn't say it's his, it has a term for an idea he thinks that is already in our minds. But the term is prima facie duty. That's a moral duty, all other things being equal. Okay, prima facie duty. There you go. Primafacie, duty. It's a duty at first glance, or you could say a duty, other things being equal. Now, according to Ross, prima facie duties become actual duties when there are either no other relevant moral considerations, or when those prima facie duties will outweigh the other competitive prima facie duties. Ross, again, was an ethical intuitionist. So let me try to explain this by a concrete example. Suppose you make a promise to meet somebody for lunch, and let's suppose there are no countervailing moral considerations. Then by default, that you've generated, of course, a prima facie duty, which will become by default your actual duty. Your duty, all things considered, if there are no other countervailing moral considerations, and no other relevant prima facie duties governing that context. Okay, but let's suppose that you have a different situation of the sort I just described earlier, and that is you've promised to meet someone for lunch, and yet on the way to lunch you have a friend who desperately needs to be rushed to the hospital. Okay, so that the latter prima facie duty is going to be more serious. It's going to be weightier. It'll override the former one, the promise to meet someone for lunch, and then it will become your actual moral duty. Okay, so prima facie duties have variable moral weight. Ross says that we have a good grip on this, but not a perfect grip. Sometimes we're not sure that we've done the right thing because of competitive prima facie duties. Now, Ross's theory is pluralistic in its view of the sources of duties, whereas classical utilitarianism tends to be monistic, that is, viewing maximizing pleasure or happiness as the source of all duties. Ross's theory also doesn't see obligations as absolute and exceptionless in the way that Kant looked at promise keeping and telling the truth. Ross, again, was an ethical intuitionist who thought that his ethical theory was grounded more in common sense than either utilitarianism or Kantian ethics. I told you for Kant the big thing was reason. For Ross, it's ethical intuition. As an ethical intuitionist, Ross believed that the basic principles of duty are self-evident and that we are able to weigh the relative importance of each duty when there's a conflict between duties, though he didn't think that we can always be sure that we've done the right thing when there's a conflict. What are some critical questions or inquiries one can ask of non-consequentialism in general? Although there is value, certainly, in treating people as having individual rights, there can arise contexts in which there can be conflicting claims of rights. People can disagree over whether employees have a right to keep their jobs except when they're fired for just cause. People can also disagree over whether there's a right to medical care. Now, our author, Shaw, sums up the situation pretty well. First, even the deliverances of moral common sense have to be examined critically. And second, non-consequentialists should not rest content until they can find a way of resolving disputes among conflicting prima facie principles or rights. This is not to suggest that non-consequentialists cannot find deeper and theoretically more satisfying ways of grounding moral claims and of handling disputes between them. The point to be understood here is simply a necessity of doing so. Okay? So, what happens is our author Shaw says that if you examine these different theories, you'll see that there are a number of morally relevant features of our conduct. One will definitely be consequences, will be the consequence for ourselves and others. And certainly Shaw says we all have an interest in getting along with other people, in increasing happiness and decreasing unhappiness. Okay, so he thinks that's certainly a quite relevant value for us to be pursuing. But he also says it's important for us to understand moral motivation, and Kant is a central figure there. And he says it's also important for us to recognize the importance of ideals, whether it's the ideal of conscientiousness, whether it's the ideal of honesty, whether it's an integrity. And so he talks about the importance of ideals. He talks about the importance of consequences. He talks about the importance of moral motivation. And he says all these things are important, and we can get value from all these different theories. And I think that to some degree that's the way Shaw is. I mean, he's kind of eclectic, trying to draw a value from diverse sources. So, and that's why we're looking at the different theories and both their strengths and their weaknesses. So, in any event, I pretty much covered what I wanted to cover in the second chapter of the book. And before the first test, we're going to have a review. So you're going to need to know the different ethical theories. You're going to need to know what psychological egoism is. You're going to need to know the different forms of ethical or rational egoism. And that'll require you to understand the difference between a descriptive theory and a prescriptive or normative theory. And you're going to have to know, again, the Kant's theory. You're going to have to know something about his theory of moral motivation. You're going to need to know also about utilitarianism and ethical egoism. You're going to need to know something about Ross's theory and what prima facie duties are, and the fact that they can conflict, and some prima facie duties can override others. And we're going to go over all of that again before we go over during when we go over the test, the test review. I want to emphasize to you the importance, obviously, of doing the readings, but also the importance of regularly viewing these lectures. And the good thing about them is that you can pause them and you can go over material repeatedly. And I do suggest pausing after every 25 minutes or so and taking a break and giving your brain and your body in general time to relax. And then I think you'll remember more. I think you'll be more alert. And the beauty of these videos is that you can go over them repeatedly. And so, again, I've pretty much covered what I wanted to cover for this second lecture and for the second chapter of William H. Shaw's book, Business Ethics. Thank you.